The vote had already been counted before I reached the podium. I knew at the moment I stepped into the grand convocation chamber and saw 600 delegates sitting with the stillness of creatures who had already made up their minds. They were not there to listen. They were there to witness. There is a difference, and I had spent 20 years in diplomatic halls learning to feel it in the air before a single word was spoken. My name is Lena Voss. I was 43 years old, and I was about to become the last human being to ever address the Galactic Council. The chamber was enormous, built to impress species with 12-foot wingspans and compound eyes. Every surface curved upward like the inside of a shell, and the acoustics were designed so that a whisper at the podium sounded like thunder in the upper galleries. I had always found it theatrical. On that morning, standing alone in the center of it, I found it suffocating. The council speaker, a six-limbed elder of the Orati called Velshan, did not greet me. He simply gestured to the podium with one pale arm, the way you might gesture to a drain. I walked to it without hurrying. The charges against humanity had been read the day before. I had sat in my delegation chamber and listened to 4 hours of translated testimony describing Earth as a destabilizing force. Reckless expansion. Unsanctioned colonization of 3 uninhabited star systems. Failure to request corridor permits for 17 hyperspace transits. Refusal to submit to council population audits. That last one had made me laugh. Population audits. As if the number of humans alive was a threat that needed to be managed. I placed my hands on the podium and looked out at the chamber. The Orati, the Velthari, the Dresh, the Kel, the Amori, the Sivan, and 400 more species, all staring at me with varying degrees of contempt, curiosity, and boredom. Somewhere in the upper gallery, a Velthari delegate sat alone, apart from the rest of his group. I noticed him because he was the only one in the chamber who looked uncomfortable. I opened my mouth and gave them the speech they did not expect. I did not apologize. I did not explain. I did not argue the charges point by point the way my advisors had spent 6 weeks coaching me to do. I had thrown those notes away the night before, sitting in my hotel room with a glass of water, watching the planet's twin moons rise through the window. What I said instead was simple. I told them that humanity had come to the stars not because the council invited us, but because looking up and staying put is not something humans are built to do. I told them that our colonization of 3 star systems had displaced no one, harmed no one, and taken nothing from any species in that chamber. I told them that our hyperspace transits had followed every physical safety protocol even when we declined to file the paperwork, and that the difference between filing paperwork and actually being safe seemed to matter a great deal more to the council than it did to the universe itself. And then I told them the truth. I said that Earth was not afraid of this vote. I said that we had entered the council 30 years ago with open hands and good intentions, and we had spent those 30 years watching species half our size and a quarter of our population treated as valued members while humanity was managed, capped, and quietly resented for growing too fast and thinking too freely. I said that we had noticed. And I said that if the council chose to cast us out today, they should do so with full knowledge of what they were actually voting for. They were not voting to punish Earth. They were voting to free it. I stepped back from the podium. Velshan called the vote without comment. It took 4 minutes. The results appeared on the central display in every language simultaneously. 604 in favor of full expulsion. 0 abstentions. 1 vote against. I looked up at the Velthari delegate in the upper gallery. He was already looking at me. He gave me a small nod, the kind that carries meaning without words. I did not smile. I did not react at all. I simply gathered the single folder I had brought to the podium, turned, and walked toward the chamber doors. Behind me, Velshan was already announcing the administrative details of our expulsion. Trade rights, revoked. Hyperspace corridor access, terminated. Diplomatic recognition, withdrawn effective midnight of that standard galactic day. All human vessels in council space given 48 hours to depart. The chamber doors were heavy and slow. They opened for me with a soft pneumatic sigh, and I stepped out into the corridor beyond, where my 2 junior diplomats were waiting with expressions that I can only describe as controlled devastation. I looked at them both. I reached up and removed the translation earpiece from my right ear. I had worn one every day for 20 years. It was small, warm from my skin, and I dropped it into my jacket pocket. I said, quietly, in plain English that no alien in the building could understand without their own device, we are done asking for a seat at their table. We are going to build a better one. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. We walked out of the building into the pale gold light of a foreign sun, and behind us the doors of the Galactic Council closed with a sound like a lock turning. I did not look back. And why would I? Everything interesting was ahead. The council had given us 48 hours to clear council space. We were gone in 30. Not out of fear. Out of efficiency. There was no point in lingering in a building once you had decided to tear it down, and Earth had a great deal of work ahead of it. I spent the transit home writing a report that no one in the diplomatic corps wanted to hear. Not because it was dark, but because it wasn't. I wrote that the expulsion was the best thing that had happened to humanity in a century. I wrote that the council had just done us the enormous favor of removing every constraint we had politely accepted in exchange for membership, and that we should be grateful, and that we should not waste a single day. The head of the diplomatic corps read my report and asked me what I thought should happen next. I told him, close every council-facing embassy. Redirect every credit in the foreign affairs budget to the science and engineering ministries. And find me the name of that Velthari delegate who voted no. He asked me why. I said, because he is the only one in that chamber who understood what just happened. And we are going to need friends who understand things. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded and went to make calls. I went to find my family. My daughter was 9 years old. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I arrived home, doing arithmetic in a paper notebook because she said screens made her eyes tired. She looked up when I came in and asked if the aliens had been mean to me. I sat down across from her and told her the truth. I said yes, some of them had been. And I said that it was going to be all right, and that by the time she was grown, the word council was going to mean something very different than it did today. She thought about this for a moment. Then she went back to her arithmetic. Kids are like that. They accept enormous information and continue doing what they were doing, because the present moment always seems more pressing than the future. I have always envied that quality. It is, in its own way, the most human thing about us. I made tea and sat at the table beside her and watched her work. Outside the window, it was an ordinary evening. The neighbor's dog was barking. A delivery vehicle hummed past on the street. Somewhere down the block, someone was grilling food and the smell of it drifted through the window screen. The galaxy had just cast us out. And life went on in the most stubbornly, wonderfully ordinary way. Good, I thought. Let them think that's all we are. Ordinary people living ordinary lives on a small blue planet at the edge of nothing. They had no idea what ordinary people do when someone tells them they are not welcome. We build. That was 40 years ago. And now I am standing in the same chamber, at the same podium, and the faces looking at me are different, and the balance of power in this room is not what it was. But that part of the story belongs to someone else. It belongs to Arjun Mehta, who was 14 years old on the day they voted us out, and who spent the next 4 decades becoming the kind of person the galaxy had not prepared for. Let him tell you what the quiet years looked like from the inside. I was not supposed to be a soldier. My name is Arjun Mehta, and when I was 14, I wanted to be an architect. Not of ships or weapons. Of cities. I used to draw buildings in the margins of my school notebooks. Tall ones, with wide windows and green spaces built into every floor, the kind of structures that assumed the people inside them deserved light and air. I still think about that sometimes. I think about the person I might have been if the council had not voted the way it did. But they did vote, and the world changed, and 14-year-old boys adjust faster than anyone expects. I remember the night the news came through. My father had the broadcast on in the living room, and I came downstairs for water and stood in the doorway watching Ambassador Voss walk out of the convocation chamber on a screen the size of our wall. My father was sitting very still, which was not like him. He was a loud man, easy with laughter and louder with anger, but that night he was just still. I asked him what it meant. He said, "It means we are on our own." I said, "Were we not on our own before?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he almost smiled and said, "No, we thought we had partners. Now we know better." I went back to bed and lay awake until the sun came up, thinking about what it meant to know better. That question followed me for the next 10 years through every decision I made. Earth changed fast. Not dramatically, not with announcements and speeches, though there were some of those. It changed the way a person changes after a hard loss, quietly, internally, in the way they make decisions afterward. The United Earth Directorate formed within 18 months of the expulsion, not by force but by agreement. Every spacefaring nation, every independent orbital authority, every lunar and Martian colony signed the compact. The arguments were short. The mathematics were not complicated. Alone, any one of our factions could be isolated. Together, we were something the galaxy had not bothered to calculate. I enrolled in the engineering corps at 22, 2 years after the Directorate announced its first major infrastructure initiative. They called it the Internal Network Project, which was a deliberately boring name for something extraordinary. The project's real goal was to build a faster-than-light travel system that did not depend on Council hyperspace corridors. The Council's corridors were physical structures. Enormous, ancient, built by species that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years before humanity reached orbit. They were like roads between planets, and using them required permits, fees, and the ongoing goodwill of the Council itself. Losing access to them had been considered, by most analysts, to be the killing blow of the expulsion. Without the corridors, interstellar travel for human ships was reduced to sublight crawls that took generations. The Directorate looked at this problem and decided it was an engineering challenge. I was assigned to the full drive research team in year 4 of the Internal Network Project. I was 26, and I was the youngest person in the room by 11 years. My supervisor, a compact and quiet woman named Helen Dorsey, introduced me to the team on my first morning by saying, "This is our June. He thinks differently. Let him think." I spent the next 3 years thinking. The concept of full drive was not new. Theoretical papers on spatial compression had existed for decades. What was new was the motivation. Before the expulsion, full drive research had been low priority, underfunded, treated as the kind of speculative science you pursued when you had spare time and no more urgent problems. After the expulsion, we had no other option. The corridors were gone. We had to fold the road ourselves. The breakthrough came not from a dramatic experiment but from a mistake. A junior engineer named Patrick Cole ran a simulation with an error in his mass ratio calculations. The error produced results that should have been physically impossible. Most people would have discarded it as a bad run. Patrick flagged it because something about the numbers bothered him. Not their wrongness. Their consistency. The impossible result appeared the same way, 3 times, across 3 different variables. Helen looked at it for 48 hours without sleeping. Then she called the team together and said, "We have been assuming that spatial compression requires anchoring to existing gravitational infrastructure. What if it doesn't?" The room was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. I won't describe the next 4 years of work in detail because the technical specifics would fill 10 books and most of it was failures. Repeated, exhausting, expensive failures that tested the patience of every ministry that funded us. Helen held the team together through all of it. She had a way of framing each failure not as a setback but as a narrowing of possibilities. Every time we learned what didn't work, she would say, "Good, that's one fewer wrong answer in the universe." The first successful full drive test was conducted in deep space, far from any inhabited system, on a vessel the size of a bus. It crossed 4 light years in 11 seconds. 11 seconds. The team stood in the monitoring room and looked at the confirmation data in complete silence for almost a minute. Then Helen sat down on the floor, which was not something Helen Dorsey did, and put her face in her hands. Not from grief. From the overwhelming release of 4 years of pressure. Patrick Cole, who was standing next to me, said very quietly, "Well, that's the corridors done then." He was not wrong. The military implications were obvious, but the Directorate was careful. They did not announce the full drive. They did not publish the data. They let the Council continue to believe that humanity was stranded, crawling between stars on slow ships, slowly contracting inward. The Council's intelligence services reported, periodically, that Earth appeared to be declining. Trade volumes down. Outer colony populations plateaus. All consistent with a civilization slowly running out of options. What their intelligence services did not report was that we had been using fold-drive ships for 2 years by that point, moving goods and people and equipment through folded space while the Council watched our official traffic and saw nothing remarkable. I was reassigned to the military division the year fold drive became operational. I did not design weapons. I designed the doctrine around which our forces would operate in a world where conventional galactic military assumptions no longer applied. Everything the Council's member species understood about warfare depended on corridor access. You moved fleets through corridors. You established choke points at corridor mouths. You blockaded by controlling the roads. What do you do when one side has no roads? You improvise. You become unpredictable. You study every conflict in galactic history in which a smaller force defeated a larger one, and you find the common thread, and the common thread is always the same: the smaller force did something the larger force did not expect. I spent 2 years studying the thread until I could see it in my sleep. During those same years, something else was happening. Something quieter and in some ways more important than anything happening in our laboratories or our military academies. Ambassador Voss, true to her word, had found the Velthari delegate who voted against our expulsion. His name, transliterated into English, was something close to Elven. He was elderly, precise, and had spent 50 years watching council politics with the detached interest of someone who had long since stopped expecting them to be good. He had voted against the expulsion not out of sympathy for humanity, exactly, but out of a calculation. He believed the council was making an error it would eventually regret, and he wanted it on the record that at least one vote had disagreed. Voss met with him privately on a neutral station, without translators, using a communication relay she had built specifically for the conversation. They talked for 6 hours. What came out of that meeting was a quiet information-sharing arrangement that both sides maintained for the next 20 years. Elvin fed us council session summaries, fleet deployment schedules, and the internal politics of which species were unhappy with which agreements. In exchange, we gave him full drive schematics. Not complete ones. Enough for his people to understand what we had built. He never used them against us. He never shared them with the council. He was, as Voss had predicted, a person who understood things. The second development during those years was the one that would matter most in the long run, though at the time it appeared almost accidental. A full-drive survey team, mapping potential routes in an uncharted region the council had never bothered to catalog, encountered a civilization. Not a member species. Not a council observer. A completely independent civilization called the Droven, living on 3 worlds in a small cluster of yellow stars that the council's charts had marked as uninhabited. The Droven were not primitive. They were simply small and quiet and had no hyperspace capability, which in the council's framework made them irrelevant. They had been observed once, decades ago, by a council survey ship, which had noted them in a database entry and moved on. Our survey team did not move on. They spent 3 weeks in orbit around the Droven homeworld, making careful contact, learning the basics of the language, sharing food, and explaining, as simply as possible, where they came from and what had happened. The Droven's response, translated through 6 layers of linguistic approximation, came out as something like, "You were rejected by the powerful for being too ambitious. We know this feeling. Please come down." Our team came down. I read the first contact report on a transport ship somewhere between Earth and our second colony, and I sat with it for an hour. Then I forwarded it to Voss with a single note: "This is how it starts." She replied, "I know." She had known before any of us. The Droven became our first partner. Not a colony. Not a subject. A partner. They had resources we needed and we had technology they had never imagined, and the exchange between us was honest and fair and produced results that benefited both sides visibly and quickly. Within 3 years of first contact, Droven agricultural output had tripled, and Earth's access to rare mineral deposits in the Droven cluster had eliminated a production bottleneck that had been slowing our shipbuilding program. And the Droven told their neighbors. Their neighbors told their neighbors. By the time I was appointed to lead the newly formed Terran Compact Defense Planning Group, humanity was no longer alone in its distance from the Council. We were not yet an empire. But we were becoming something. And the Council, busy managing its own internal politics, its corridor fees and its audit committees and its endlessly negotiated trade agreements, had not yet looked up to notice. I was counting on that. Not for much longer. But long enough. Long enough for Director Soo-Yun Park to build the thing that would make our position unassailable. Let her tell you about the compact. She built it. She deserves to explain it in her own words. The galaxy, in my experience, runs on two things. The first is fear. Everyone understands fear. It is the oldest motivator in the universe, shared by every species that has ever looked at something larger than itself and decided to be careful. The second is profit. And this, in my experience, most galactic politicians underestimate, because they think of profit as the junior partner. They believe that if you control the fear, the profit follows. They are wrong. My name is Soo-Yun Park, and I spent 30 years proving them wrong in ways that rearranged the economic map of the known galaxy. I was an economist before I was anything else. I studied xenoeconomics at Earth's Institute for Interstellar Studies, which in the years just after the expulsion was considered a somewhat optimistic field to pursue. What, people asked, is the point of studying alien economies if we are not allowed to trade with aliens? I told them that the question assumed we would always be in that position. They thought I was being romantic. I was being practical. I graduated into the United Earth Directorate's Economic Planning Division 2 years after the full drive tests, when the Directorate was still deciding exactly how to use its new capability. Most of the debate at the time was military. How do you defend? How do you deter? How do you project force? Essential questions, all of them. But I kept raising a different one in every meeting I was invited to. I kept asking, who do we want to be, once we have the power to choose? It took 3 years for anyone senior enough to matter to sit down with me and genuinely engage with the question. His name was Director Cole, Patrick Cole's father, who had moved from engineering administration to the Directorate's Strategic Planning Committee. He was a small, careful man who listened more than he spoke and made decisions slowly and almost never regretted them. He called me into his office, poured 2 cups of tea, and said, "All right, Park. Tell me your plan." I told him. The plan was called the Terran Compact Framework, and its central premise was this: the Council had built its power on a model of controlled access. You were either inside the structure or outside it, and being outside was meant to be painful enough that everyone tried to get in. The corridors, the trade agreements, the audit requirements, all of it was designed to create dependency. Depend on us, the Council said, and we will protect you. Step outside, and you are alone. Earth had been forced outside. And instead of finding emptiness, we had found the Droven. And the Droven had neighbors. And those neighbors had their own networks of species and civilizations and resource relationships that the Council had never bothered to map because the Council only paid attention to species capable of threatening it. Most of the galaxy, it turned out, was not threatening anyone. Most of the galaxy was just trying to survive, produce food, maintain population health, manage energy resources, and occasionally look up at the stars and wonder if anyone else was out there. We were out there. And we were offering something the Council never had. We were offering partnership without conditions. The compact framework gave any species that joined it access to full drive trade routes, Earth's medical and agricultural technology, engineering consultation, and a mutual aid guarantee. If a compact member was threatened, the compact responded. Not with demands for tribute or loyalty tests or population audits. Just a promise. You are not alone. The conditions for membership were 3. No use of compact resources to harm another compact member. No territorial claims on uninhabited systems without compact review. Transparent resource reporting. That was it. The Council's membership process involved 462 separate requirements. I know because I had read all of them in graduate school. I sent the compact framework to Director Cole on a Tuesday. By the following Monday, he had taken it to the full Directorate Committee. By the end of the month, it was policy. The first 7 members joined within a year. The Droven, obviously. Then the Siren, a delicate insectoid species from a binary star system who had been paying the Council enormous corridor fees for decades just to reach their nearest trading partner, fees that consumed 20% of their entire economic output. When we offered them full drive access at cost, their delegation head wept. I am not exaggerating. She wept in the formal signing room while her government's seal was being applied to the compact charter. I have thought about that moment many times. I think about it when people ask me whether what we built was an empire. Empires do not make their new partners cry with relief. They make them cry with something else. By year 4, the compact had 11 members. By year 7, 17. By year 10, 23. The council noticed around year 6. I know when they noticed because Elvin, the Velthari delegate who had maintained his quiet information channel with Voss for years, forwarded us the summary of an emergency council session. The summary described the compact as a, quote, disorganized collection of minor species being exploited by Earth for resource extraction. I read that summary and felt something I can only describe as professional satisfaction. They had completely misread what we were doing. They thought we were extracting from our partners. They could not conceive of a power arrangement that was genuinely mutual, because they had never built one. The misreading bought us 2 more years. By year 8, council analysts had revised their assessment. The new summary described the compact as, quote, a destabilizing parallel structure that may attract council member species if not addressed. That one was accurate. 2 council member species had already sent private inquiries to our economic office, asking about the process for compact association. Not full membership. Association. Observer status. The ability to access full drive trade routes and compact medical technology without formally leaving the council. We said yes. We said yes to both of them, quietly, and gave them observer agreements that asked almost nothing of them and delivered immediate, measurable economic benefit. Within 18 months, their population's quality of life metrics had improved enough that the data was public and visible to every other council species. The council's response was a blockade. Not of Earth. They were not quite prepared for that. They blockaded several full-drive trade routes, stationing council warships at coordinates that corresponded to where our ships would exit fold if they were using the routes that had been publicly registered. I read the blockade notice on a Wednesday morning and spent about 40 minutes thinking. Then I called our logistics team and had the trade routes shifted. We registered new exit coordinates. Ships continued moving. The council warship sat at the old positions for 11 days before someone in their command structure realized the traffic was simply not coming through. The blockade became public. It was reported across the galaxy as a council enforcement action against an illegal trade network. What was also reported, because some journalists were paying attention, was that the trade network had not been disrupted in any measurable way. Ships kept arriving. Goods kept moving. The council warships sat in empty space like guards posted at a door that had been quietly relocated to another building. The story spread faster than the council wanted. A council admiral named something I will transliterate as Vrathsol sent a formal communication to the directorate. I was asked to receive it because it concerned economic matters and the admiral apparently had strong feelings about our trade policies. The communication listed 17 violations of council economic law, demanded that we pay fees for the corridor equivalents we had been using without registration, and concluded by stating that if the compact did not dissolve within 90 days, the council would consider military intervention. I drafted the response myself. I kept it short. I thanked Admiral Vrathsol for the communication and informed him that Earth and its compact partners declined the offer, wished the council a productive session, and would be available for further communication through standard diplomatic channels. I sent it, then walked to the window of my office in the directorate building, which overlooked a harbor, and watched the water for a while. Director Cole came to find me 20 minutes later. He said, "They are going to send a fleet." I said, "I know." He said, "Are we ready?" I thought about our June Meta, who I had met twice and who had struck me both times as someone who had been preparing for a specific moment for so long that the moment's arrival would not surprise him. I thought about the 23 species who had signed the compact charter, and the 2 observer species who had not but who received our medical shipments every quarter. I thought about the Siren delegation head crying in the signing room. I said, yes. I believed it. And the day the fleet arrived, I found out if I was right. The first thing you need to understand about the fleet is the size of it. I had seen the Council's military projections in Elvin's briefings for years. I had run exercises against modeled versions of their formations. I had studied their tactics in 30 years of historical engagement records. But seeing it on a real display, 600 warships arranged in a formation so large it took 2 minutes to scroll across my screen, was something the models had not fully captured. There is a difference between knowing a number and watching it appear. My name is Yusuf Okafor. I was commander of the Terran Compact Defense Fleet on the day the Council's Grand Armada arrived at Compact Space, and the first thing I said when I saw the display was, "They brought the whole thing." My tactical officer, a sharp-minded woman named Caroline Dale, looked at the same display and said, "Yes, sir, they did." There was a pause. Then she said, "Should we be concerned?" I said, "Probably." "How much coffee do we have aboard?" She said, "Enough." I said, "Then let's get to work." I want to be clear about something before I describe what followed. I am not a person who finds conflict exciting. I know the stories paint soldiers that way, the ones who burn for confrontation, who feel most alive when things are dangerous. That is not who I am. I became a military officer because I was good at planning, good at anticipating, and good at making decisions under pressure without letting the pressure make the decision for me. That morning, the pressure was immense. The Armada had come through conventional hyperspace routes, the Council's own corridors, and it had assembled at the edge of compact space with what was clearly meant to be a statement. The formation was not a subtle one. 600 ships do not arrange themselves in a neat, visible arc unless they want to be seen. They wanted to be seen. I let them be seen for 4 hours. I made no transmissions, moved no ships, and did nothing that could be interpreted as provocation or retreat. My fleet remained in its standard holding positions. We tracked every vessel in the Armada in real time and logged everything. At hour 4, the Armada's command ship sent a transmission. It was from Admiral Wrathsoul, whom I had read about extensively in Elvin's briefings. He was, by most accounts, a capable officer who had spent his career operating in a framework where the Council's authority was assumed to be absolute. This was his weakness and I had planned around it. He told me to stand down our fleet, accept Council inspection teams aboard all compact vessels, and present ourselves for negotiation under Council terms. I listened to the full transmission. Then I issued the order we had spent 4 years preparing. Across every inhabited system in Council space, in locations that had been calculated down to the meter, compact full-drive ships appeared simultaneously. Not dozens. 63 vessels, each positioned in close orbit of a Council member world. Not firing. Not threatening. Just there. Visible on every sensor grid in the Council's network. Visible to every government, every civilian population, every news outlet broadcasting across the galaxy. And then I sent my own transmission, not to Admiral Wrathsoul, but to all 63 of the Council member worlds simultaneously. I said, in the Council's diplomatic common tongue, "We are not here to harm anyone. We are here to demonstrate that the Compact is present everywhere the Council assumed it was absent. We ask the Council to stand down its Armada and begin genuine diplomatic dialogue. We will wait 20 minutes for a response." I put the transmission on repeat. Then I sat in my chair and waited. The Armada did not move as a unit. It could not, because the moment my transmission reached the Council homeworlds, which it did simultaneously via fold relay, the governments of 8 separate species immediately contacted their military commanders and ordered their ships to return home to defend their own systems. 8 species. 112 ships. Gone from the Armada in 40 minutes. The formation collapsed from 600 to 488 ships while Admiral Wrathsoul was still composing his response to my transmission. He responded with a demand. "Stand down the compact vessels or face immediate engagement." I replied, "We have stood where we stand." The Armada had 600 ships an hour ago. How many does it have now? There was silence for 31 minutes. Then 104 more ships peeled off toward home. Council politics, apparently, had become very heated very fast across multiple homeworlds simultaneously. The Armada now had 384 ships. Wrathsoul, to his credit, was not a person who gave up easily. He ordered the remaining fleet into engagement formation and advanced on our holding position. This was the part one had been less confident about. The full drive bluff, or near bluff, had worked better than the best models had predicted. But models are not battles. Battles involve real ships, real decisions made under real stress, and real consequences for every error. We had not tested a full engagement. We had exercises. We had projections. We had 4 years of doctrine built around the idea that our ships could fight differently than Council ships, move faster, fold away and reappear, strike from angles that required no corridor. What we did not have was certainty. Caroline Dale pulled up the engagement projections and put them on my secondary display without being asked. I looked at the numbers. Our models gave us a 61% probability of successfully repelling the advance with acceptable losses. Acceptable losses is a phrase I have always found unbearable. It means people. I read it as people. The Armada closed to engagement range. Wrathsoul's lead ships opened fire. What happened next I will describe as accurately as I can, stripped of the drama that the history books would later apply to it. Our ships did not fight the way Council ships fight. Council military doctrine assumes that you hold a position, absorb damage, return fire at volume, and win through attrition and mass. It works well when both sides are using the same corridors and the same speed limits and the same tactical playbook. We did not play from the same book. Full drive combat maneuvers, the ones our June's doctrine team had developed over 4 years, allowed our ships to disappear from one location and appear in another within seconds. Not randomly. Precisely. Calculated repositioning that took our vessels out of incoming fire, placed them at angles where return fire was most effective, and constantly denied the Armada's targeting systems the stability they were designed to expect. It looked, on the Armada's displays, as if our ships were everywhere at once. We were not everywhere at once. We were very precisely somewhere specific, over and over, and the calculation behind each fold was the product of 4 years of intensive mathematical work by people who had not slept enough in all of that time. The battle lasted 6 hours. We lost 112 ships. I will not summarize that with a word like acceptable. 112 ships is 112 crews, and I know the names of too many of them to pretend otherwise. The Armada lost 241 ships in the same engagement. The remaining 143 ships withdrew. Not in panic. In an orderly, deliberate retreat that told me Wrathsoul, for all the miscalculations that had brought him to this moment, was at least the kind of commander who did not sacrifice people pointlessly once the mathematics had turned against him. I respected that. I did not pursue. When the Armada had cleared compact space, I stood down the full-drive vessels from the Council homeworlds. All 63 of them folded home without incident. No shots fired from any of those positions. The threat had been the point. The point had been made. Caroline Dale brought me a cup of coffee without being asked. I sat with it for a long time before I drank it. The loss report came in from our medical division over the next hour. Casualties across the fleet. The numbers were lower than the projections had feared and higher than I had hoped. There is no version of that arithmetic that feels good. I read every name on the list. It took time. I believe it should take time. When I was finished, I sent a fleet-wide communication. Not a victory announcement. Not a speech. Just a simple statement that I was proud of every person aboard every ship, that the compact had defended itself, and that the question of what came next was one we would answer together. Then I went to the recovery bay and walked among the wounded for 3 hours. I want to be clear about something, because the history of this engagement has a tendency to focus on tactics and full-drive innovation and the clever theater of the 63 positions. That is all real. It all happened exactly as described. But the thing I remember most from that day is not any of it. It is the face of a 22-year-old engineering technician from our third ship who had taken shrapnel to her left side and was sitting up in a medical bay with a bandage around her ribs, asking the medic next to her if the ship had held. The medic told her yes. The ship held. The compact held. She nodded, lay back, and closed her eyes. That is what I am carrying from that day. The Council requested peace talks 8 days later. They sent the request through the Velthari diplomatic office, which was the only channel they had that they knew we monitored. The request was formal and carefully worded and contained no apology, but it contained something more useful, an acknowledgement that the compact was, quote, an established interstellar entity with legitimate interests that the Council wished to discuss in good faith. Legitimate interests. 40 years after Lena Voss was shown the door, we had legitimate interests. The Directorate selected one person to attend the preliminary talks. They sent Voss. She was 83 years old and walked with a cane she had not had 40 years ago, and she dressed in a plain gray suit and wore no translation device because she had long since memorized enough of the Council's common tongue to manage without one. I was told that when she entered the conference room where the council's lead negotiators were waiting, 2 of the 6 delegates stood up automatically. Not out of protocol. Out of something less calculated. She sat down, placed her cane against the table, looked at each face in turn, and said, "I believe you had some conditions you wanted to discuss." They agreed to every preliminary item before the session was an hour old. The final agreement was Ambassador Voss's to write. She had earned it. She was the right person to explain it, and to explain everything that came after. This is where a part of the story begins again. And mine ends. The coffee was good, by the way. I always remember to mention that. It matters, when everything else is noise, to notice the things that are simply good. I have stood at this podium twice. The first time, I was 43 years old and angry in the quiet, cold way that is more dangerous than any shouting. The chamber was the same as I remembered it. The acoustics were the same. Even the smell was the same, something mineral and faintly sweet, the product of 600 alien biology sharing air in an enclosed space. What was different was the sound when I entered. 40 years ago, the chamber had been filled with the low murmur of delegates settling into comfortable certainty. They knew the outcome. They had already decided. The noise was the sound of people who were finished thinking. This time, when I walked through the same heavy doors, the chamber went quiet. Not the quiet of indifference. The quiet of attention. The quiet of 604 species looking at a person they had voted to erase from galactic society and finding that she had not, in fact, been erased. I walked to the podium without hurrying. I have never hurried to a podium in my life. I placed my hands on the edges of it, the same way I had 40 years ago, and I looked out at the chamber. Some faces were familiar. Not many. 40 years is a long time, and most of the species in that room lived lifespans not entirely unlike ours, which meant that the people who had voted against us were largely gone. Their successors were looking at me with expressions that ranged from carefully arranged neutrality to something I can only describe as cautious admiration. A few looked frightened. I did not blame them for the fear. They had good reasons for it. In the upper gallery, in the same isolated seat where he had sat 40 years ago, was Elvin. He was very old now. I did not know his species' full lifespan, but he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been alive for a long time and had learned not to waste the remaining portion of it on unnecessary motion. His eyes, large and dark and utterly still, found mine the moment I stepped to the podium. I gave him the same small nod he had given me 40 years ago. He closed his eyes briefly. That was his equivalent of a smile. I had learned that over 30 years of careful communication across a diplomatic channel that had never been officially acknowledged. I turned to the chamber. I did not begin with what they expected. They expected a victory speech. Humanity triumphant, the council humbled, the terms of our return laid out in formal language with appropriate gravitas. I had read 3 drafts of exactly that kind of speech, prepared by very talented people in the Directorate's communications office, and I had put all 3 of them in a drawer. Instead, I told them about my daughter. I told them that on the night I came home from the chamber after the first vote, my daughter was 9 years old and sitting at the kitchen table doing arithmetic in a paper notebook. I told them what she asked me, and what I answered, and how she nodded and went back to her work. I told them that she was now 49 years old, and that she was currently the chief engineer of the Compact's 7th-generation full-drive project, and that she had her mother's habit of doing math on paper even though the screens were better. I told them that she had 3 children of her own. That her youngest, a boy of 11, had asked her recently why humans and the council did not get along. And that she had told him something I did not know until she told me. She had said that they get along now. That it took a long time and a lot of work, but that the galaxy was big enough for everyone if everyone was willing to stop treating it like a competition with only one winner. I told the chamber that my 11-year-old grandson believed her. I told them that so did I. And then I gave them the speech. Not a victory speech. A proposal. I had spent 18 months writing it, with input from every Compact member species, from Elvin's private office, from economists and engineers and military planners and, most importantly, from the species that had no military and no engineers and no full-drive technology and simply wanted to live without the fear that something larger would one day arrive and take what little they had. The proposal was called the Open Framework Accord. Its central principle was this: membership in the Galactic Council and membership in the Terran Compact were not mutually exclusive. Any species could participate in both. The Compact's mutual aid structure, its full drive trade access, its medical and agricultural technology sharing, and its three-condition membership requirements were open to any species that wanted them, regardless of their relationship with the Council. In exchange, the Council would formally recognize the Compact as a co-equal political body with a permanent seat in this chamber. Not a member seat. A mediating seat. The Compact would sit outside the Council's voting structure, answerable to no faction, with the specific function of representing species that were too small, too remote, or too recently contacted to have a voice in Council proceedings. The Council would gain a diplomatic partner with reach it did not have. The Compact would gain legitimacy it had built itself but wanted formally acknowledged. And the species at the margins of the galaxy would gain, for the first time, a body that existed specifically to speak for them. The reaction in the chamber was not applause. Applause was not a thing most of these species did. What happened instead was a kind of collective shift, a settling, the way a room full of people exhale when something that has been tense for a very long time is suddenly, unexpectedly resolved. Velshan's successor, a young Orati female named something I will transliterate as Shival, looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "You have had this prepared for some time." I said, "Yes." She said, "You could have presented this before the military engagement." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you?" I thought about how to answer this honestly, because she deserved honesty and I had spent enough of my career in rooms where honesty was diluted until it meant nothing. I said, "Because you would not have been ready to hear it." 10 years ago, the Council was not asking what kind of galaxy it wanted to build. It was asking how to manage a problem. Problems get managed. Proposals get negotiated. We needed to be in a position where you were genuinely asking the first question before I gave you the second answer. Shival was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a very patient way to operate." I said, "It is a very human way to operate." The vote on the Open Framework Accord took 3 days. It was not unanimous. Nothing in galactic politics is unanimous. But it passed with enough margin that the outcome was not in doubt after the first round, and the holdouts were, for the most part, persuaded by arguments from their own colleagues rather than anything we said. The formal signing session was held in a smaller chamber, the kind used for bilateral agreements rather than full council pronouncements. I sat across a long table from Shival, with the Compact's full council of member representatives arranged behind me and the council's signing delegation arranged behind her. Elvin had been given a seat at the end of the table. Not as a signatory. As a witness. He had asked for nothing, and the Compact had offered this, and the council had not objected because objecting to a Velthari elder sitting quietly in a corner was not a political battle anyone wanted. When the signing was done and the documents sealed and the formal acknowledgments exchanged, Elvin rose from his chair and made his way slowly to where I was standing. He moved with great care, and I waited for him without any sense of impatience, because some things are worth the time they take. He stopped in front of me and looked at me with those still, dark eyes. He said, in the Velthari tongue that I had spent 15 years quietly learning, "I voted no because I knew you would not stay quiet. I did not know what you would become. I voted no because the alternative was saying yes to something smaller than what you deserved, and I had enough certainty about your species even then to know that smaller things do not contain you." I said, also in Velthari, "You were the only one in 600 who saw it." He said, "I was the only one who was looking." We stood in that small room for another moment, this very old alien and this very old human, and then he reached out with one careful hand and placed it briefly on my arm, the Velthari gesture for something that does not translate precisely into English but carries the meaning of acknowledgement, of a long journey completed, of one chapter closing in the proper way. I put my hand over his for a moment. Then he withdrew, turned, and walked slowly from the room. I watched him go. After the session, I was given a private moment in the main convocation chamber. It was empty. They had cleared it for me as a courtesy. I walked in alone, without my cane, which I had left behind in the anteroom because I did not want it in this moment, and I walked to the center of the floor and stood where the podium would have been if it were not stored against the far wall between sessions. The chamber was enormous and quiet. My footsteps echoed exactly as they had 40 years ago. I looked up at the empty galleries. I have been asked, many times since then, what I thought about in that moment. People expect something grand. A reflection on history, a sense of vindication, a feeling of completion. What I actually thought about was the kitchen table. My daughter at 9, her notebook open, her pencil moving, unbothered by the weight of the world outside the window. I thought about the Drovan delegation head crying in the signing room. I thought about Yusuf Okafor walking through the recovery bay, reading names. I thought about Caroline Dale handing someone a cup of coffee because she had noticed they needed one. I thought about Patrick Cole flagging a number that did not make sense, because something about its consistency bothered him, and Helen Dorsey going 48 hours without sleep because she had seen something in that number that changed everything. I thought about all the ordinary people who had done extraordinary things, not because they were exceptional or chosen or born for a moment, but because the moment arrived and they were prepared and they did not look away from it. That is what humanity is. Not the fold drive, not the military doctrine, not the diplomatic framework, though all of those things matter. What humanity is, at the core of it, is a species that does not know how to stop working on the problem in front of it. Every species in the galaxy has that quality in some form. Every civilization that has ever looked up at the stars and reached toward them is made of the same stubborn refusal to accept that the current situation is the permanent one. What made Earth different was not that we were smarter, or braver, or born with some special advantage. What made us different was that when they closed the door, we did not stand outside it asking to be let back in. We went and found a better door. And then we made sure it was open to everyone. The chamber stayed empty and quiet around me. Outside, beyond the walls, the galaxy was doing what it always did. Species were being born and dying and trading and arguing and inventing and discovering and making the same mistakes and finding the same recoveries they had always made. The Compact's ships were moving through folded space on 100 different routes. Somewhere, a Compact medic was treating a patient on a world that had never heard of the Galactic Council. Somewhere, a Drovan engineer was working with a human engineer on a problem that neither of them could have solved alone. Somewhere, a child was doing arithmetic in a paper notebook. I bent down and picked up my cane from where I had left it at the edge of the floor. Then I walked out of the chamber, through the heavy doors that were no longer locked to me, into the corridor beyond, where my granddaughter was waiting. She was 11, the one who had asked his mother why humans and the council did not get along, and his mother had brought him to witness the signing, and he had watched everything with enormous eyes and not said a single word until now. He looked up at me and asked, "Did it work?" I said, "Yes." He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "What happens now?" I took his hand. I said, "That is the best question anyone has asked today." We walked out of the building together, into the light. And that, finally, is where the story of what they did to us ends. And where the story of what we did with it begins.